There's a woman standing in front of her closet, and she's not doing what you think she's doing. She's not choosing an outfit. She's choosing whether to bother. Her daughter is coming over in 20 minutes. Years ago, this moment would have been full of quiet panic. Is the house clean enough? Is she dressed nicely enough? Will her daughter notice the dust on the piano? Will she say something about the extra weight her mother has put on? Will there be that look, the one that says, "You could try harder"? She used to rehearse for visits like this. She used to perform. Tonight, she puts on the sweater she's worn 3 times this week. She doesn't wipe down the piano. She sits in her chair by the window, and when her daughter walks in and says, half joking, "Mom, you didn't clean up for me?" she just laughs, a real laugh, and she says, "No, honey, I didn't." Something happened between the woman who used to rehearse and the woman in that chair. Something shifted, quietly, over years, without her even noticing the exact day it happened. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what that something was, because it's probably already happening to you too, whether you've named it yet or not. We're going to talk about why, somewhere in the second half of life, so many people simply stop caring what others think of them, and why, instead of being a loss, it might be the most honest freedom you'll ever feel. In the next hour, we're going to walk through 10 different reasons this shift happens, not as a checklist, but as a real, layered look at the psychology behind it. We'll talk about why survival changes your relationship with fear, why time itself starts filtering out what deserves your attention, why grief, of all things, becomes a strange kind of teacher. We'll talk about relationships, the ones that quietly fall away, and the ones that get truer once you stop performing for an audience. And we'll talk about what's actually waiting for you underneath all those years of trying to be acceptable, the person you were before you learned to flinch at judgment. This isn't a lecture about not caring what anyone thinks, ever, about anything. It's something more honest than that. It's about understanding where this freedom comes from so you can trust it instead of second-guessing it. So let's start at the beginning, with the first thing that has to happen before any of this becomes possible. Reason number 1 is this: you've already survived the version of being judged that you used to fear the most. Think back, not to something abstract, but to something specific. A moment in your life when you were terrified of what people would think of you. Maybe it was a divorce. Maybe it was losing a job you'd built your identity around. Maybe it was a diagnosis, a bankruptcy, a mistake you made that you were sure would define you forever in other people's eyes. At the time, the fear of judgment felt unbearable. You imagined the whispers. You imagined the pity, or worse, the quiet superiority in other people's faces. And then it happened. The thing you feared came true. People did find out, people did talk, people did judge. And you're still here. This is the part almost nobody explains to you when you're young. The fear of judgment is almost always worse than judgment itself. When you're anticipating it, it feels like it could break you completely, like your whole sense of self depends on avoiding it. But once you've actually lived through it, really been talked about, really been misunderstood, really had people think less of you, you learn something your younger self couldn't have known. You learn that you survive it. Not comfortably, not painlessly, but you survive it. And once your nervous system has proof of that, the fear starts to lose its grip, because fear runs on uncertainty, and you've removed the uncertainty. There's a second layer to this, too, and it's the part that surprises people most. You also learn how quickly other people's judgment fades from their own minds. The thing that felt like a permanent stain on your reputation, the mistake you thought everyone would remember forever. Most people forgot about it within a season. They had their own lives, their own worries, their own quiet catastrophes to manage. What felt to you like a spotlight was, to almost everyone else, a passing thought. That recalibration, realizing judgment is rarely as loud or as long-lasting in other people's minds as it is in yours, changes how much power you're willing to give it going forward. And here's where the sides of this matter. Think about it from the other direction, too. Think about someone you judged once, maybe someone you knew years ago who went through something messy, publicly. Do you still think about it? Really? Or did your attention simply move on the way everyone's does? If you can admit that your judgment of others fades that quickly, you have to admit theirs probably does too. That's not you being defensive. That's just how human attention actually works. It's short, it's self-focused, and it rarely lingers on anyone else's story as long as we fear it will. That's not you becoming careless. That's you becoming someone who has finally done the math on fear and found out it was charging you more than it was worth. If you've lived long enough to survive being judged and come out the other side still standing, still yourself, maybe even more yourself than before, that's not a coincidence. That's evidence. And evidence is what finally quiets a fear that used to run entirely on imagination. So the next time you catch yourself softening, editing, shrinking to avoid someone's opinion, ask yourself honestly, have I already survived worse than this? For most of you watching, the answer is yes. And that answer is the first crack in the wall that used to keep you performing. Reason number 2 follows naturally from the first, because once fear starts losing its grip, something else starts tightening its grip instead, and that something is time. Picture an ordinary Tuesday. Someone invites you to something you don't really want to do. A gathering, an obligation, a favor for someone who's never really shown up for you. 20 years ago, you might have said yes automatically, already calculating how to seem gracious, how to avoid seeming rude, how to manage what they'd think if you said no. Now you pause. And in that pause, a quieter, more honest question rises up. Do I actually have time for this? That question, do I have time for this, is not a small shift. It's one of the most powerful psychological turns that happens in the second half of life, because it changes the entire filter through which you evaluate other people's opinions. When you're young, time feels infinite, almost abstract. You can afford to waste an evening on people who don't really see you, because there will always be another evening. You can afford to shape yourself around someone's approval, because you assume you'll have decades to eventually get around to being fully yourself. Time doesn't press on you. It just exists, quietly, in the background, patient and endless feeling. But somewhere in your 50s, 60s, 70s, the math changes. You start doing the quiet arithmetic almost without meaning to. You think about how many more summers you might reasonably expect. How many more holidays. How many more ordinary Tuesday afternoons with people you love. And once that arithmetic enters your mind, even subconsciously, it becomes almost impossible to keep spending your remaining time trying to manage what people who don't matter much to you might think. There's a version of this that shows up in something as simple as a family gathering. You used to sit through hours of a relative's political rant, nodding, keeping the peace, worried about seeming difficult. Now you find yourself saying, gently but clearly, I'd rather not get into that today, and leaving it there, not out of rudeness, but because you've realized that peacekeeping at the cost of your own peace is a trade you're no longer willing to make. You're not spending your remaining Tuesdays managing someone else's comfort at the expense of your own. This is where it helps to look at it from another angle, too, the way someone who study grief and aging often describe it. As time horizon shrinks, priorities don't just narrow, they sharpen. People become more selective not because they've grown cold, but because they've become more discerning about where warmth is worth spending. Emotional energy starts to function like a currency you finally understand the real value of, after decades of spending it carelessly. That's not withdrawal from life. That's not you giving up on people. That's you finally refusing to spend a non-renewable resource, your remaining time and attention, on the opinions of people who were never going to remember, appreciate, or reciprocate the effort anyway. So when you notice yourself less willing to sit through a draining conversation, less willing to perform enthusiasm you don't feel, less willing to say yes just to avoid disappointing someone, that's not you becoming difficult in your old age the way people sometimes worry. That's not decline. That's clarity. Time has quietly become your teacher, and it's teaching you where your remaining hours actually belong. Reason number 3 is one that tends to sneak up on people, because it doesn't come from a single dramatic moment. It comes from decades of quiet, repeated observation. And it's this: you've watched other people's opinions change like weather, and somewhere along the way you stopped building your sense of self on ground that shifts that easily. Think about someone from your past, a boss, a neighbor, even a friend whose opinion of you once felt enormous. Maybe there was a season where they thought the world of you, praised you, sought you out. And then, for reasons that had little to do with who you actually were, that opinion shifted. Maybe they got busy. Maybe they got jealous. Maybe they simply moved on to admiring someone else the way people do. Nothing about you changed in that shift. Only their weather changed. If you've lived long enough, you've seen this pattern repeat itself more times than you can count. Not just with one person, but with entire circles, entire seasons of your life. People who adored you in your 30s barely remember you in your 50s. People who criticized you fiercely at one point later apologized, or forgot they'd ever said anything at all. Opinions, it turns out, are rarely permanent verdicts. They're weather systems, blowing through based on someone else's mood, someone else's insecurity, someone else's unrelated bad day. Here's the deeper psychological piece. When you're younger, you don't yet have the data to know this. Each new opinion feels like it might be the true one, the accurate one, the one that finally reveals who you really are. So you chase consistency in something that was never designed to be consistent, other people's minds. It's like trying to build a house on the surface of the ocean. It's exhausting, and no matter how skilled you get at balancing, the ground never stops moving. What changes with age is that you've now watched this pattern complete itself, over and over, enough times to trust the pattern instead of the individual instance. You've seen popular opinion turn on people who didn't deserve it. You've seen people written off who later turned out to be some of the wisest, kindest people you knew. You've seen your own reputation rise and fall for reasons that had almost nothing to do with your actual character. And each time you survive one of these cycles, you learn a little more that the weather isn't the climate. The weather is loud and immediate. The climate, who you actually are, underneath all of it, is slow and steady and doesn't change nearly as much as the daily forecast suggests. There's another side worth naming honestly. This doesn't mean feedback stops mattering entirely. There's a difference between weather, a passing mood, a fleeting judgment, a stranger's snap reaction, and genuine, repeated, loving feedback from someone who has earned the right to speak into your life. Wisdom isn't about ignoring everyone. It's about finally being able to tell the difference between a passing cloud and a person who has actually stood beside you through seasons. That's not you becoming rigid or unreachable. That's you finally learning the difference between the sky and the ground. So the next time someone's opinion of you shifts, a friend pulls away, a family member seems disappointed, a stranger online says something unkind, you're allowed to notice it without rebuilding your entire identity around it. You've seen the weather change before. You know, by now, that you're still standing on solid ground underneath it. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching a video about getting older, you're watching a video about getting free. And we've only covered 3 of the 10 reasons this freedom takes root. There's more ahead, including the one almost nobody admits out loud. So stay with me. Reason number 4 is one that people rarely say directly, maybe because it sounds slightly unflattering at first, but once you sit with it, it's actually one of the most liberating truths of getting older. You've finally realized that most people are too busy worrying about themselves to spend much time judging you. This isn't cynicism. It's closer to relief. When you're young, there's an almost involuntary assumption that you're the main character in everyone else's story too. That when you walk into a room, people are noticing your outfit, your weight, your stumble over a word, the way your voice cracked during a toast. That assumption fuels so much of the self-consciousness of youth. You imagine an audience that is, in reality, mostly imaginary. By the time you've lived several decades, you've had enough experience being on both sides of that equation to know the truth. Think about the last time you were at a gathering and someone else tripped, or said something awkward, or wore something slightly out of place. Did you spend the rest of the week thinking about it? Did it change your opinion of them in any lasting way? For almost everyone, the honest answer is no. You noticed, you moved on, and within a day it was gone from your mind entirely, replaced by your own concerns, your own to-do list, your own private worries that were far louder to you than anyone else's small misstep. Once you fully absorb that this is how most people experience you too, as a brief notice, not a lasting verdict, something in your chest loosens. The imagined audience shrinks down to its real size, which is almost always smaller and far more distracted than you assumed. There's a slightly harder layer underneath this one, though, and it deserves honesty rather than comfort alone. This realization can sting a little before it frees you. For a moment, it can feel almost lonely to realize that people aren't watching you as closely as you always feared, because somewhere underneath the fear of judgment was often a quieter wish to be truly seen. But those are 2 different things. Being watched out of judgment and being seen out of love are not the same experience. And one of the quiet gifts of this realization is that it clears space for the second one. Once you stop performing for an audience that was never really paying attention, you have more energy left over for the handful of people who actually are. Consider it from another angle, the way it plays out at something like a class reunion. People walk embracing themselves, wondering if others will judge how they've aged, what they've accomplished, what they haven't. And almost universally, what they find is that everyone else in the room is doing the exact same thing. Too consumed with their own nerves, their own comparisons, their own inner monologue, to spend much real energy scrutinizing anyone else's. That's not you becoming invisible. That's not you maturing less. That's you finally seeing clearly how much of the judgment you feared was never really coming from the outside world in the first place. It was coming from inside your own head, borrowed and amplified over years of assuming an audience that mostly existed in your imagination. So the next time you feel that flush of self-consciousness, walking into a room, speaking up in a meeting, showing up somewhere without quite looking your best, remember, everyone else in that room is far too occupied narrating their own life to spend much time narrating yours. That's not a sad truth. That's the truth that finally lets you exhale. Reason number 5 is one that almost nobody wants to talk about because it doesn't come wrapped in anything comfortable. It comes from loss. And yet, grief, as strange as this sounds, turns out to be one of the most efficient teachers of what actually matters. There's a particular moment that so many people describe after losing someone close to them. A spouse, a sibling, a close friend, sometimes a child. It's the moment, sometimes weeks or months after the funeral, when they're standing in a grocery store, or folding laundry, or sitting in a waiting room, and they suddenly find themselves unable to care about something that used to matter enormously. A social slight, a neighbor's disapproval, whether the house looks presentable enough for visitors. All of it suddenly feels impossibly small next to the size of what they've actually lost. This is grief doing something almost nobody expects it to do, recalibrating your entire sense of scale. Before loss, so many things feel urgent. What people think of your choices, your appearance, your parenting, your career, your home. After loss, you've been shown, in the most undeniable way possible, what actually deserves that level of urgency. And it's almost never any of those things. It's time with the people you love. It's presence. It's honesty. It's the years you have left, spent as fully and truthfully as you can manage. Once your nervous system has been through that recalibration, it doesn't easily go back to caring about the small stuff the way it used to. You've stood at the edge of the thing that actually matters, and it's changed your depth perception permanently. Things that once loomed large. A critical comment, an unreturned invitation, someone's disapproving glance, now register as exactly what they are. Small, survivable, and nowhere near worth the emotional cost of losing sleep over. There's another side of grief that deserves to be named honestly, too, because it's not only about losing people, it's about the grief of lost time, lost chances, lost versions of yourself you once thought you'd become. That kind of grief teaches a slightly different lesson. It teaches urgency. It whispers, quietly but persistently, don't spend what's left of this pretending. Don't spend it managing an image. Spend it being real, because real is the only thing that will have mattered when this is over. That's not you becoming hardened by loss. That's not you becoming numb. That's you finally seeing life at true scale, with grief as the harsh but honest instrument that measured it for you. If grief has touched your life, and by this point in life it almost certainly has, you already understand something that people who haven't yet been through it are still waiting to learn. Caring less about small opinions isn't coldness. It's what happens naturally once you've been shown, unmistakably, what the big things actually are. Reason number 6 is quieter than grief, but no less powerful, and it has to do with something simple. You've finally earned the right to take up space, and to say what you actually mean. Think about how much of your younger life was spent translating yourself for other people, softening a request so it wouldn't seem too demanding, laughing at something that wasn't funny to keep the mood light, agreeing with an opinion you didn't share because disagreement felt like too much of a risk. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from decades of that translation work. Decades of managing yourself down to a version that felt safer for other people to receive. Somewhere in the second half of life, many people notice they've simply run out of patience for that translation process. Not because they've become unkind, but because they've finally recognized the cost of it, the cost of decades spent as a slightly edited version of themselves, never quite saying the true sentence, always saying the safer one instead. There's real psychology behind why this happens later in life rather than earlier. Decades of experience have given you something you simply didn't have access to when you were younger. Proof. Proof that, when you do speak plainly, most relationships survive it. Proof that the people worth keeping in your life can handle your honesty, and often respect you more for it. Proof that the version of you who stayed quiet to keep the peace often wasn't actually protecting the relationship. She was just protecting herself from a conversation she was afraid to have. Consider this from the other direction. 2. Think about someone in your life who has always spoken plainly, without much hedging. Do you respect them less for it, or more? Most people, when they think honestly, admit they respect directness. They may not always enjoy hearing it in the moment, but they trust it. They know where they stand with that person. That's the quiet gift you're finally giving the people around you when you stop editing yourself down. Not a harsher version of you, but a more trustworthy one. That's not you becoming difficult in your later years, the way some worry about being perceived. That's not you losing your softness. That's you finally understanding that softness and honesty were never actually opposites. You can say a hard truth gently, but you can no longer justify saying a false thing sweetly, just to keep the peace at your own expense. So when you notice yourself finally saying the plain sentence instead of the careful one, I don't want to go, that hurt my feelings, I disagree, that's not decline, and it's not bitterness. That's decades of translation work, finally set down, because you've earned the right to speak in your own true voice. Before we go further, take a breath here. You don't need to do anything with that last thought right now. Just let it sit. Some of what we're covering in this video isn't meant to be acted on immediately. It's meant to be recognized quietly as something that's already true about you, waiting for permission to be named out loud. Reason number 7 has to do with performance. Specifically, the realization that you've been performing for an audience that, when you really look closely, was never actually going to be there for the parts of your life that mattered most. Picture the people whose opinions used to weigh the heaviest on you. Not necessarily family, but often something more diffuse. Coworkers from a job you left 15 years ago, acquaintances from a social circle that dissolved once everyone moved on with their lives, even strangers whose fleeting reactions somehow felt disproportionately important at the time. Now ask yourself honestly, where are those people now? Are they the ones who show up when you're sick? Are they the ones who call on a hard anniversary? Are they the ones who will sit with you in a hospital waiting room, or help carry a casket, or simply check in on an ordinary Tuesday just to see how you're doing? For most people, the honest answer is no. The audience you spent years performing for was almost never the audience that showed up for the parts of life that actually required someone to show up. This is one of the more sobering realizations of getting older, but it's also one of the most clarifying. You start to ask a new question before investing emotional energy in someone's opinion. Will this person be here in 10 years? Will they be here in the hard season, not just the easy one? And once you start asking that question, the pool of opinions that still deserve your energy shrinks dramatically, not because you've become cold toward people, but because you've finally started reserving your emotional investment for people who've proven they're actually invested in you. There's a slightly different angle worth considering here too, the way this shows up with people who genuinely love you but express it clumsily. Sometimes the people who will show up in the hospital waiting room are also the ones whose opinions used to sting the most, precisely because their love came wrapped in criticism or worry, or an old habit of trying to control rather than trust you. Learning to stop performing for them doesn't mean cutting them off. It often means finally being able to separate their love, which is real and worth keeping, from their opinions, which you're finally allowed to hold more loosely. That's not you writing people off. That's not you deciding love has to be perfect to count. That's you finally directing your limited emotional energy toward the relationships that have actual weight-bearing capacity, instead of the ones that only ever asked you to perform. If you've made it this far in this video, you already know this isn't something you're just half listening to in the background. You've stayed for the parts that ask something of you, the honest parts, not just the comforting ones. And that tells me you already understand, on some level, exactly what we're about to talk about next. Reason number 8 is where all of this starts to gather into something larger, because it has to do with a realization that, once it lands, tends to change how you carry yourself for the rest of your life. Approval was never permanent in the first place, so chasing it was always going to be like chasing smoke. Think back across your whole life at the different versions of acceptable you tried to become. Maybe in your 20s it was about career achievement. In your 30s, maybe it was about how your household looked, how your children behaved, whether your marriage seemed successful from the outside. In your 50s, maybe it shifted again, toward health, toward how gracefully you seemed to be aging, toward whether you still seemed relevant, still useful, still needed. Each decade came with its own version of the finish line, the place where, if you could just reach it, the judgment would finally stop and the approval would finally be secure. Here is the truth almost nobody tells you until you've lived long enough to see it yourself. There was never a finish line. Approval isn't a fixed prize you earn once and keep. It's a subscription that has to be renewed constantly, in the eyes of people whose standards shift as often as their moods do. You could meet every expectation someone had of you last year, and this year, without you changing at all, their expectations will have quietly moved. This is why chasing approval is so exhausting, not because you're bad at it, but because the target was never designed to hold still. The smoke. You can spend your whole life trying to hold it in your hands, and the moment you think you've finally gripped it, it's already dispersed, reforming somewhere just out of reach again. Once you see this clearly, really see it, not just intellectually understand it, but feel it in your body, something releases. You stop trying to catch smoke. You start asking a different question entirely, one that has an actual stable answer. Not will this earn approval, but is this true to who I am, and is it kind to the people I love? That question, unlike the pursuit of approval, actually has a finish line. You can answer it today honestly and be done. There's a quote that captures this shift better than almost anything else, one worth sitting with for a moment. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius wrote that nearly 2,000 years ago, and it still holds because the mind chasing approval has always been chasing something outside its control, other people's shifting perceptions. The mind that finally turns inward, toward its own honest standards, is the only mind that ever finds real, lasting ground to stand on. That's not resignation. That's not giving up on caring about others. That's you finally putting your energy into the one thing that was always actually within your power, your own integrity, instead of the one thing that never was, other people's approval. Reason number 9 brings us back to the people in your life, because as opinions stop mattering as much, something unexpected happens to your relationships. They don't get smaller in a sad way. They get smaller in a true way. Here's what that looks like in practice. The wide circle of acquaintances you used to maintain out of obligation, the people you called out of guilt, the invitations you accepted out of fear of seeming rude, the relationships that existed mostly on the surface, those start to quietly fall away. Not through dramatic confrontation, usually, but through simple attrition. You stop initiating. They stop initiating. And what's left, when the dust settles, is a much smaller group of people, but a far more honest one. This can feel, at first, like loss. If you're in the middle of this shift right now, you might be noticing your circle shrinking and wondering whether something is wrong with you, whether you're becoming isolated or difficult or less likable than you used to be. But look closer at who's actually still there. Look at who still calls. Look at who you can sit with in total silence and feel completely at ease. Look at who you can tell the truth to without pre-editing it first. That smaller circle isn't evidence of decline. It's evidence of refinement. You spent decades collecting relationships the way you might collect anything else, a little indiscriminately, adding more without always asking whether each one was actually nourishing you. Now, without the same pressure to perform for approval, you're naturally left with the relationships that never required performance in the first place, the ones built on something sturdier than impressing each other. There's a particular kind of relief in the people who remain in this smaller circle, because you no longer have to wonder what they really think of you. You already know. You've tested it through disagreements you survived, through hard seasons you got through together, through moments where you showed up as your actual unpolished self and they stayed anyway. That's not a fragile kind of connection, vulnerable to a single bad mood or misunderstanding. That's the kind of connection strong enough to hold the entire weight of who you actually are. Consider it from the other angle too. Think about the relationships in your life that, if you're honest, never really recovered once you stopped performing for them. Some of those endings hurt. Some of them still do. But their ending wasn't proof that something was wrong with your choice to be more honest. It was proof that those relationships had been built on the performance, not on you. And a relationship that can only survive your performance was never really a relationship with you at all. That's not you becoming harder to love. That's you finally being loved by people who were never loving a performance to begin with. They were loving you. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a video you're just half watching. You've stayed through 10 reasons, through grief, through the quote, through the honest parts that don't always feel comfortable, and that tells me something about you. It tells me you're someone who's ready to hear the last piece of this, the one that ties everything else together. Reason number 10 is the deepest one, and in some ways it's really the answer underneath all 9 of the others. Underneath all those years of managing other people's opinions, there was a person. And that person is finally getting to come out. Think about who you were before you learned to flinch at judgment, before a teacher's disapproval, a parent's disappointment, a classmate's mockery, or a partner's criticism taught you to start editing yourself in advance. There was a version of you somewhere in early childhood who simply was, who sang too loudly, who asked blunt questions, who wore the clashing colors without a second thought, who cried when sad and laughed when happy without calculating how either would be received. That person didn't disappear. She got buried, slowly, under decades of learned caution. But she's still there. Here's what happens as you get older and the fear of judgment loosens its grip. That original person starts resurfacing. Not all at once, but in small, unmistakable moments. The joke you make without checking first whether it's appropriate, the outfit you wear because you like it and not because it's flattering by someone else's standard, the opinion you voice at dinner that you would have swallowed 20 years ago. Each one of those small moments is that original, uncalculated self, stepping back into the light after a very long time spent in hiding. This is, in the end, what all 10 of these reasons have actually been pointing toward. Surviving judgment. Time growing precious. Watching opinions shift like weather. Realizing people are too busy with themselves to watch you as closely as you feared. Grief recalibrating your sense of scale. Finally earning the right to speak plainly. Recognizing which audiences were never really there for you. Understanding that approval was always smoke. Watching your circle shrink down to something true. All of it has been clearing space, slowly, patiently, over years for the same outcome. The return of the person you were always meant to be, before the world taught you to perform someone more acceptable instead. That's not you losing yourself in old age, the way some people fear aging means. That's not decline, and it's not becoming someone unrecognizable. That's the opposite. That is you, for maybe the first time since childhood, finally becoming fully recognizable, to yourself most of all. So here we are, back at the beginning, back to that woman standing in front of her closet, choosing not to bother rearranging her whole life around a 20-minute visit. Remember the question we left open at the very start of this video? What actually happened between the woman who used to rehearse for every visit and the woman sitting calmly in her chair by the window? Now you know. Nothing dramatic happened in a single moment. 10 quiet, cumulative shifts happened, over years, each one loosening her grip on an audience that was never really watching as closely as she once feared. If any part of what we've talked about today felt uncomfortably familiar, the years spent editing yourself, the relationships that only survived because you performed for them, the exhausting chase after an approval that never once held still. I want you to hear this clearly. None of that time was wasted. It was the long road that brought you here, to this exact moment, with this exact freedom finally within reach. You didn't arrive here by accident. You arrived here by surviving, by grieving, by watching, by finally getting tired enough of performing to set the performance down. And if you're someone who's already living inside this freedom, someone who's already stopped rehearsing before family visits, already stopped chasing weather instead of climate, already speaking your true sentences instead of the careful ones, then I hope this video gave language to something you'd already felt but maybe never fully named. That matters too. Being seen in your own experience, even by a stranger's voice on a screen, is its own small kind of relief. Wherever you are on that road, I want you to know something simple. This channel exists for exactly this, for the reflections that don't get spoken enough out loud, for the quiet permission so many of us are still waiting for someone else to give us, even though it was ours to give ourselves all along. If this found you at the right moment, consider staying a little longer. Subscribe, not because a video asked you to, but because there's more of this waiting for you here. More honest conversations about what it actually means to grow older and freer and finally, unmistakably, yourself. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I don't take that lightly, and I hope you don't either, because an hour at this stage of life is no small thing to give. I'm glad you gave it here,